I'm Jennifer Steinhauer. I'm the director of the Speaker Series here at the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. I want to welcome everyone to this pop-up event looking at the situation on the ground in Iran as best as we can unpack it here in Chicago, both in terms of what's happening there and the news within the news cycle and how it is playing out here in the United States in the diaspora. And beyond, obviously. This event is in keeping with the University of Chicago's commitment to free expression. We will be having a civil conversation here, and we will open it up later to questions. Everyone will be able to express their point of view and to ask questions as long as they do not infringe on the ability for others to express their points of view. So for the last 5 weeks, Iranians have engaged in protests all across their country, sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman arrested by the morality police in September because she was allegedly in violation of head covering laws. What began as bushfires leading to reports of scores of deaths and serious injuries around the country may in fact becoming an inferno, more than 4 decades into the rule of the Islamic Republic. Today, to sort of unpack this situation and teach us all more about this growing news story is journalist Negar Mortazavi and Saeid Golkar. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Service at the University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. Welcome to you both. Professor, if I could start with you. Tell us all what you think is the most important thing right now, the most crucial elements through the historical lens that you have on Iran.
Thanks for having me. Actually, let's start to talk about 2022 pro-Iranian protests. As you said, the trigger of the protest was the Mahsa Amini death. But there are a lot of structural cause, a long-term cause that make people come to the street and risk their life. Islamic Republic from 1979 to 2022 gradually has lost all of its pillar, the legitimacy, the power, the ability to co-opt, the ability to deliver the social services, the goods, and gradually relied only on the repression. And that's why you will see from 1979, the Islamic Republic from the beginning rely on the repression without any doubt, but gradually became more repressive regime compared to the past. What we are seeing right now in 2022 is a huge dissatisfaction, is a huge resentment of the Iranian against of the Islamic Republic. If you listen to the song that became the anthem of this protest or the revolution, I prefer to call it the revolution, and I will tell you why actually I call it the revolution without being a successful right now, is if you listen to this anthem of the Baraye or because of or for, you will see there are a lot of grievances, ecological grievances, environmental grievances, economic resentment. So the people are actually coming to the street because of the social restriction, because of the political repression. So there are a huge element behind of this mass uprising. And the Islamic Republic are mostly using right now the brutal repression, the naked force to silence people. Why I'm calling it the revolution before move on. We usually in political science distinguish between revolt and revolution. Revolution is usually the successful revolt. But if you think about what the people want in this round of the protests, and if you go back from 1979 to 2022, you will realize people not only want to change the regime. Against the regime change got a negative connotation by the George W. Bush policy, but think about a transformation, moving out to a new political system. People want to not only they want to have a regime change, not only they want to to collapse the Islamic Republic, but also they want to change the social structure. These patriarchal societies, this movement, part of this movement is the main slogan is woman, liberty, and life, and that's targeted that, social repressive system. So it is a revolution, and it's a big one, especially mostly because it's not only targeted the change of the Islamic Republic, it also are thinking to change the social structure of the Iranian society.
We'll get more granular about what we believe is desired within the country. But Negar, I think one of the most striking things, especially for a Western audience, is seeing women in the streets, pulling off their hijab and so forth. What can you tell us about the significance of women in this particular moment?
Sure. So this is, I think, a continuation of past rounds of mass protests against the government, the system. We saw mass protests in 2009. Back then, it was the largest since the 1979 revolution. Took very long, about 10 months to a year. Millions of Iranians on the street. Another round of mass protests, 2019, brutally suppressed by the regime in a matter of weeks. And we've seen protests in between by different segments of the society. This time around, we're seeing an intersectionality of the different communities, from teachers to university students, high schoolers, lawyers, even oil workers joining. But at the core of this is essentially a feminist uprising, a women's uprising against years of systemic oppression, discrimination, discriminatory laws against women, and the violent enforcement of these laws. The spark of it is also a women's rights issue. Mahsa Amini, this woman who dies in the custody of the Murata police because of how she's dressed. You have even some religious Iranians, some hijabi women online were asking what exactly was wrong, because we have seen images, a video footage of how Mahsa Amini was dressed when she was in detention, when she was detained. You have people asking what exactly was wrong with what she was wearing, that she had to die for it. Women are sympathizing with Mahsa Amini, seeing themselves in Mahsa Amini, saying, this is how I dress. She was a small town, 22-year-old girl from a small Kurdish town, and she gets picked up by the Murata police and essentially ends up in a hospital and dead. Men are seeing their own sisters in Mahsa Amini, sympathizing with that, saying, this is how my sister dresses and goes on the street every day. Are you going to, is she going to end up dead, or are you going to kill her too? So that's the underlying, I think, or at the core of this. We see a lot of women leading these protests, a lot of young girls, even high schoolers. And now yesterday I saw a video of small children. It looked like elementary school, 3 girls who were chanting women, life, freedom, waving their headscarves in the air. And when I talk about the systemic repression and the discrimination against women, it's rooted not only just in the law and the state-sanctioned regulation, it's also rooted in religion, in tradition, and in patriarchy, decades, if not centuries of patriarchy that have been imposed on women, but under this government, also in the name of religion in the Islamic Republic. It starts with the dress code, but it doesn't end there. It's discrimination through family law, marriage, divorce, child custody, inheritance. Even as a woman, if you want to leave the country, you need permission from your husband. There was this famous case of a captain of a national team who didn't get permission from her husband to leave. So she had to stay behind. That captain had to stay behind for a major international competition where the team went to that international competition and participated. So the discrimination and the systemic repression and the violent enforcement of it, which we see in the form of the morality police, is just something that women have been dealing with in their everyday life, personal and professional. And I also want to emphasize they've been pushing back against it. There has been a slow and gradual push in how they dress, in their role in the society. Women comprise more than 50% of university students in Iran because they studied more and they put more effort and they got into university spots. But at the same time, I think this is an outpouring of years and years and layers of anger and individual defiance that we see in this collective pushback against the entire system.
Okay, and
can I add something to the discussion?
Sure, please.
Without any doubt, women have the important role in this round of the protest. Without any doubt, Iranian women from 1979 to have been repressed systematically, as the Negar said. Without any doubt, you can see very visible role of the Iranian female student, even elementary, in elementary school. But we shouldn't undermine this reality that the 2022 is not only about, the woman demand for more freedom. Again, I want to go back and to listen to that song, and you will realize that there are a conversion of environmental, political, social, economic, and all of these grievances came together, and the woman, without any doubt, they are pushing this. They are the engine of the protest. But there are a lot of grievances, and everybody has their own concern.
Can I just respond very quickly?
Well, before we go that, Negar, I'll get back to you on that, but because I want to talk about the external and internal forces. And I think you've both done a really nice job of setting the table here for this discussion. But I want to, before we get into that granularity on causes, I want to almost back up a little bit. And before we also talk about how much regime change, so to speak, is actually desired internally and the possibilities for that, I want you both to candidly answer if you believe that the Islamic Republic of Iran is capable of reforming itself into a more representative government. Both, do you think that? And also, candidly, how have your views evolved on that question over the last decade?
Should I go first?
Sure.
All right. Let me just respond very quickly as far as, I don't think we're undermining I talked about the intersectionality of the different communities and the different protesters, and I'm happy to get into the various grievances and the demands. There's definitely very serious political, economic, cultural, social underlying grievances and demands, and that's why the protesters keep coming back to the street. But we shouldn't also forget that at the core of this was the spark of this was the death of the young woman, was this women's rights issue. And that in itself, I think, is very revolutionary, the way this feminist uprising has been at the core of this. As far as the Islamic Republic reforming, I guess that's something that even the reformists themselves, the reformists meaning card-carrying reformist political party members and senior reformists, some of which are in prison, and those who are outside, banned from any meaningful political work and activity, have really lost hope for. It's the rigid and very violent response of the state to any form of dissent, any form of reform, any form of internal, essentially, avenues for change have been closed. We saw in the previous presidential election last year when Ebrahim Raisi won, any viable competition within the formerly accepted reformist and moderate parties were disqualified from running. He's essentially seen by a big portion of the population as a shoo-in candidate that the conservatives, hardliners sent in. The year before that, similar situation with the parliamentary election. So that's actually one of the reasons we see so many people on the street and so angry with such radical slogans, because they don't see any other avenues for change. This is from the view of the general public, but also from the view of the reformists themselves. Now, is the system going to is this going to be a wake-up call? Are they going to feel like an existential threat? Is this going to be a turning point? That's unclear. But I think the crisis of legitimacy is something that they have been increasingly dealing with and realizing, and that's also what I think is the reason for this way of brutal and violent crackdown on any form of protest and dissent that we saw in 2019, 2009, and 2019, and we're seeing the same blueprint being used right now.
Professor?
I really don't think the Islamic Republic is reformable. Structurally, institutionally, is irreformable. And I will tell you why I believe that there will be no reform in Islamic Republic in the years to come. Actually, what we are seeing right now, that was a discussion from the reform area during 1997 to 2004 that Mohammad Khatami became the president. And some people came as a reformist and promised that we are going to reform the system and gradually change it. What we have seen in the second and the decade is the personalization of power in the hand of Ayatollah Khamenei. I explained it, Ayatollah Khamenei from 1989, when he became the supreme leader, gradually personalized first the security service and especially IRGC, later on clerical establishment, seminary school. And from 2019, he tried to personalize the Iranian state bureaucracy. So if you think about the Islamic Republic has three pillars: the security that actually co-opt the people, the clerical establishment, and the seminary who give the legitimacy to the system, and the IRGC as the security one. The Ayatollah Khamenei has created a very personalistic regime. Reformists are completely out of touch with this reality that Ayatollah Khamenei from 1997, when Mohammad Khatami became the president, started to block the reform, and gradually they became irrelevant. Under the Rouhani, there was some hope that maybe, the Rouhani is able to resist Ayatollah Khamenei. Again, Ayatollah Khamenei shows that he concentrated enough power. He completely personalized the security and military, and he doesn't really need the reformists anymore right now. So for me, I think the Islamic Republic is irreformable structurally, and I don't have any hope for any meaningful reform in Iran in the years to come.
So let's take the conversation into outside of Iran as per se. I don't think the vast majority of Americans, even those who are somewhat dialed into this story as they're seeing it fold out in their newspapers and their television screens, have even a modicum of clue of how this is playing out in the diaspora. And as we all know, this event itself here at the IOP was extremely controversial. We have seen universities across the country try to put up similar events, massively protested in ways that have been actually quite surprising to those who have even seen these types of conversations interrupted across a wide range of issues. So could you both go granular through your observations, your own experiences, and also stepping back and explain to us why the diaspora is so polarized around what's going on in Iran right now, please?
I really don't think the diaspora is so polarized. I like Iran itself inside of the country. If you think about 1979 to 2009, Islamic Republic gradually alienated many of the Iranian. In the first decade was the upper class, gradually middle class. 2009 Green Movement was a movement of the middle class that just demanded, where is my vote, and they demanded a new election. But Islamic Republic gradually lost them. In 2010 decade, Islamic Republic lost the poor. 2017, 18, and 19, especially, that the Islamic Republic brutally repressed was a movement of the poor, of the lower social classes. So Islamic Republic gradually lost all of its social bases and became, relied only on a brutal force. Outside of the country, you have the same story. Most of the Iranian at the beginning were, some of them support the Islamic Republic, some of them nem, and then gradually the number of the people who come to this realization that there will be no reform under the Islamic Republic, and under the Islamic Republic, Iran as a country is going to lose all of its potential or increasing. So you can see, if you compare it, for example, 2009 diaspora reaction to the Green Movement to now, you will realize most of the people are completely aware and are much more, visible on the social media, on TV, to claim that the Islamic Republic is not reformable and we have to change it. I think this is a very natural phenomenon that we see it inside of the country. Islamic Republic lost even its social basis, more lower social class poor, and outside of the country, the people who supported the Islamic Republic for many reasons, they came to this realization that is not going to work. So in my opinion, it's not really a polarization. It's not a 50-50. Most of the Iranians are gradually going toward that. And that's why when they perceive that maybe, somebody or something is not on the line with them, they are pressuring, that individual or that social group, mostly because they think, maybe they are not coming to this realization.
through the prism of sitting here at the University of Chicago, it doesn't feel like a small number of people doing that. But Negar, I would like you to respond to the question, and specifically too, as it applies to you, because you know that you are someone who's very much in the crosshairs of this, and there's a lot of statements that people have made about you actually being in cahoots with the regime and so forth. And so, how do you respond to that? And what is your observation through your own personal experience here?
So what I've seen, I mean, I don't want to just speak of my own circles around me or social media, which is highly, highly weaponized by interest groups, especially when it's in Farsi. But polls have been done of the diaspora, especially here in the US, the Iranian-American community. The consistent line of the community has been they want better improvement of human rights in Iran. So essentially, they oppose the human rights and abuses of the Islamic Republic, that they oppose broad economic sanctions, the way that it targets every aspect of the economy. That's what the majority I've seen in these polls. They oppose a war, so in the form of a military attack, a full-on Iraq-style or Afghanistan war between the US and Iran. And they want, what I've seen from the recent is that the majority want better relations between their two countries, which is the homeland Iran and also the United States. How to achieve that, how to improve human rights and the abuses in Iran in the form of a different regime, a regime change, with reform, without reform, to improve, for example, the economy, as they're seeing economic sanctions or the impact of the economic sanctions are directly on the middle class, on the working class Iranians, and not so much on the elite. So that's one thing on the diaspora, and most of the disagreement is how to achieve what it seems like more of a broader agreement. But as far as attacks on female journalists, unfortunately, I'm living in this landscape and I'm witnessing it firsthand. It's not so much every day happening in the academia, but it's so much happening in the journalism work. Any form of nuance or any sort of perception of trying to look at the both sides or the different aspects of an issue is completely attacked, and female journalists are the top targets of these. It's not just myself, my friend and colleague Farnaz Fasihi, a senior reporter at the New York Times, BBC Persian journalists are prime target. I actually used to work for the US funded broadcaster Voice of America in Persian. Those are also targets. And then at the same time, simultaneously targeted by the regime. Our families are pressured by the regime. My own family, I live in exile since 2009, haven't been able to return back to the country. The Revolutionary Guards has raided my family's home, taken my parents to interrogations, put them on travel bans, tried to put pressure on me and on my work to no avail. But BBC journalists, families are also under attack, VOA journalists, and then also smear campaigns online, a lot of phishing attempts, hacking attempts of our social media accounts, of our emails, lots of these bulletin style misinformation put out against us on blog style or right-wing state related Iranian media. And I see some similar tactics by interest group being deployed here on the US side or in the broader Western world. But there's also part of the population that I think over the years, or the diaspora population that over the years has become more and more radicalized, as Saeid was saying. And looking back at what they themselves believed, that they believed in reform, or that they participated in elections, or that they had a different perception of what the future could bring, I think that I see an increasing level of anger and frustration, and also a sense of powerlessness, that they can't do anything really. They can't participate in protests on the street. They can't really do anything as far as attacking the actual system of that oppression. I saw a tweet actually from a colleague yesterday that said, in very tyrannical situations, sometimes you see the population viciously attacking each other because the main source of tyranny is actually so powerful and so distant that they can't touch it, they can't reach it, they can't bring any change to it. And I feel like that's a little bit of this kind of divide that's happening among the diaspora. And this is, I'm talking about real individuals. I'm not talking about troll networks and bot networks, because
Right.
There's also a lot of weaponization of social media that's happened in this space, which is, again, another
There
part of
definitely
that
is, and for those watching and for those who watch on the replay on YouTube, I just do want to emphasize that it's quite difficult to imagine unless you are involved in conversations like this, both the intensity, the vitriol, and how many people seem to be engaging in it, even if it's through bot repetition and so forth. It's quite something to see. And again, this is why some other universities who've tried to engage in these conversations have felt actually under threat and protest and had to close down events. Professor, I want to pick up on something that we were just talking about a second ago, which is the concept of normalizing relationships between Iran and the United States. And we've seen this play out on the floor of the United States Senate as it pertained to the Iran deal, and where that in the kind of football that became between administrations. So could you address whether you think that's possible?
Absolutely not. Let me tell you why I'm saying absolutely not. The Islamic Republic, and especially Ayatollah Khamenei, need an enemy. And they create an enemy even if they don't have an enemy. That was one of my idea, that when I was talking with somebody in the State Department, and the idea was, let's assume that we gave everything that the Islamic Republic wants, just for the sake of the argument. Said, okay, we don't think about your foreign policy involvement in the region. We don't care about your missile program. We don't care about your nuclear program. Just let's America to reopen its embassy in Tehran. The Islamic Republic never, ever will let this happen. After 2015, after the negotiation reached the agreement, immediately after that, Jawad Zarif was actually impacted mostly because shake hand with the U.S. State Department official. And Hassan Rouhani, after 15-minute talk with the Barack Obama, was completely dehumanized by the Ayatollah Khamenei. So in this system, if you think that you can, and that was a mistake in 2015, that it was the whole hope that we create this agreement and we will build upon that, based on the good, we see it that the Islamic Republic need America as its enemy. Whatever you are doing, they are going to use, America as a scapegoat to blame everything going wrong in Iran. Corruption, mismanagement, brutality, everything will. Ayatollah Khamenei just make it clear last week and 2 weeks ago that in his opinion, these protests is only made up of the United States and his enemy. He doesn't want to accept that. So if you think that you can do anything to normalize Iranian relationship with the United States, I think you have to be very wishful thinking person.
Negar, any thoughts on that?
So, when we look at U.S.-Iran relations, which is also something I've been covering for years and looking at very closely, and it's also dominated in the headlines of the media, it's always been the nuclear program, nuclear. Sometimes for an average American audience, they have no idea of the country, and you may just assume it's a nuclear program because that's what's been dominated in the headlines. And it's been a priority policy for the United States to pursue the nuclear negotiations. The reason behind pursuing the nuclear negotiations is to essentially ensure Iran's nuclear program remains civilian, doesn't ever turn into a weapons program or race towards having a bomb. It's also something that close U.S. allies in the region have been worried about, the nuclear program, Israelis, Saudis, the UAE, other Arab countries in the Gulf. And so it's been the dominating and the primary issue. Under the Obama administration, the policy was to pursue this through negotiations, through diplomacy, to try to resolve it and essentially bring Iran to the negotiating table and convince them to accept to put limits on the nuclear program. And it succeeded. Iran took the nuclear deal and accepted to put limits on the program in exchange for sanctions relief. And the policy back then, or the thinking, the strategy was that we'll take this one issue, which is a very complicated issue. It took 2 years of intense negotiations. I was covering actually those negotiations from Vienna at some point, and it was very intense. And they decided to compartmentalize the various different issues or the activities or policies of Iran and take them step by step and start with the priority. And then after that was towards the end of the Obama administration, 2016, the deal started, and then the Trump administration came. President Trump pulled out of the nuclear deal, while Iran was still abiding, the US was abiding, suddenly unilaterally the US pulled out of the deal and then imposed this policy of maximum pressure, which is something that the Republican side of the US political sphere had been pushing for. And now we see back with the Biden administration back in the White House, the policy seems to be to sort of go back to the Obama era and pursue a nuclear deal. There's been also a change of administration in Tehran with the hardliners, conservatives. That became more difficult for Biden to pursue. There was a 6 months window of opportunity when the Biden team first came into power with the Rouhani team. The deal didn't happen then. And then the Raisi team came and delay after delay. And so right now we're at a stalemate. So I think US policy consistently has been that the nuclear program is a priority, is a national security issue for the US to pursue. But at different times or under different administration, it's been pursued differently. So through negotiations with Obama, through maximum pressure with the Trump administration, and now with the Biden administration pursuing diplomacy again. As far as other issues, there's a long list that not only the US, but Europeans are also interested. Iran's the regional policy, presence across the Middle East, the proxy support, Iran's missile program, and also human rights and domestic human rights abuses in the country, domestic affairs. But I think as far as from this perspective, from my vantage point in Washington, and also looking through across the Europe, the Western Bloc, the priority has been the nuclear issue.
And I want to get back to what's going on in the country. Go ahead, Professor, go ahead.
Yes, actually, that's a problem with the US foreign policy toward Iran. You know, separating the issues and trying to solve one problem without thinking that all of these problems are connected to each other. You cannot solve the nuclear problem without thinking about, missile program or human rights violation or the normalization relationship with the United States and Iran. If really the Islamic Republic want to solve this problem, the easiest thing to do is trying to normalize, open the US embassy in Tehran, and then gradually build upon that. But we saw it for 14 days, and we always are blaming the American. Without any doubt, the US foreign policy has a lot of mistakes. Without any doubt, that's completely clear. But this is only one side of the story. We always forget that, okay, Trump administration withdraw from the deal. You are right. But what before 2015 and 2018, what the United States get from this deal? Absolutely nothing. They didn't even let the American companies go to the Iran. The Iranian president was not even able to talk with the Obama. So anything that we have done, without any doubt, the Islamic Republic gets a lot. Without any doubt, we put a lead on Iran nuclear program for a few years. But if you think that that was only the problem and we solve it, and then we go back to the human rights or the missile program on the Iran regional involvement, I think this is a very simplistic and wrong policy. We have to see it as a whole. Even I believe that we have to see most of the international relation problem right now, like for example, Russian invasion to Ukraine or China trying to intimidate Taiwan, and Iran as one big illiberal, bloc against a liberalism. If you want to take it separately and try to solve it, you always will be defeated. You have to think as a whole. You have to have a holistic view about all of this problem.
And I would like to talk more about those internal issues. Just one last thing, since we're on this particular thread of U.S. policy. Try to picture dual hypotheticals. A month from now, the protests are still in full force. Regime comes to the United States, we'll take that deal. Let's think about a situation where 6 months from now, the protests have been crushed and the White House is pondering reopening negotiations. How should the Biden White House be thinking about this in both of those hypotheticals?
Either if they're continuing. I think if the protests, I don't want to speculate right now, but I think the protests are very significant. They're different in so many ways, as also similar in past protests, but it's certainly growing. And again, a serious crisis of legitimacy. But we've also seen in the past that the state has the will and the capacity to use a lot of brutal violence to suppress protesters. Back in 2019, Amnesty International has documented at least hundreds of protesters killed on the street in a matter of weeks, thousands arrested, very harsh sentences added for in internet disruption, targeting of activists and journalists, essentially an iron fist brought down by the state to suppress. So would that also happen this time around? I don't know, it's hard to speculate, but in the scenario that the protests are continuing, I think, and it seems like right now also that's the White House policy, so a continuation of that there won't be a return to the negotiations, to the nuclear negotiations. And I also haven't seen much signals from the Iranian side, from Tehran, showing any interest to return to negotiations at this very moment. If this continues, and if protests continue within a month, which would mean that they're even more serious and more of a deeper crisis, then it doesn't seem like that's a policy, and I don't think it should be. As far as the protests being crushed or stopping, it also depends on how the government or the system, the regime responds. Is this going to be a watershed moment? Is it a turning point? Are we going to continue to see these acts of individual civil disobedience, even if the pockets of protest, the collective protests are vanished? We're still seeing women individually and men also showing these acts of civil disobedience. So is there going to be any change in how the state is perceiving the demands, the grievances, or is this just going to be a brutal, violent crushing of the protesters and just sending people back to street without addressing anything? I think in that case, I don't know. I'm not sure what the U.S. policy would be. It's hard for me to make a policy recommendation as far as that future, but I guess it's important to watch very closely. And I've seen also activists, prominent activists on the ground, women's rights activists, human rights activists, welcome some of the measures that have been pursued by the U.S. so far, the designations as quote unquote human rights sanctions, as opposed to broad economic sanctions, the designations of rights abusers, of the morality police, of various IRGC commanders, followed by the Canadian government also, and now followed by some Europeans. Also, there was a general license, a sanctions exemption essentially issued by the State Department that allows for tech companies to provide services and communications to Iranian users, essentially helping internet freedom in this limited situation. I think those have been welcomed by activists, by protesters, but it's also just, I don't know how much more influence the US or the West in general can have on this domestic issue and on the violent crackdown on the protesters beyond these measures.
Yes. My advice is actually the U.S. foreign policy should not base on the short term, what will happen in Iran if the Islamic Republic is able to crush this round of the protests or not. That's exactly the problem that I'm talking about. If you think about it in the long term, the Islamic Republic, the change of the Islamic Republic will be the biggest geopolitical change after the collapse of the Soviet Union. If you think about the Islamism came to the power from 1979 and in 1917 to now, the Islamic Republic became the manifestation of the Islamism in the Middle East, North Africa, and then support all of this Islamist movement around the world and created a lot of problems. On the other hand, paradoxically, Islamic Republic created the most pro-American, pro-Western, secular societies among of the Muslim majority countries. I believe that the Islamic Republic, quote unquote, is the most secular Muslim countries. Again, I have to define it by the decline of the religiosity and at the same time the personalization, personal interpretation of the religion. So these are the assets that we have in the region. If we just want to think about what will happen in a few months and then react upon that, we always are losing. That's the first one. The second one, I want to make sure that we understand if we have not reached to the deal by 2020, after 2 years Biden came to the power, it's not almost the problem and the fault of the Biden administration. We are assuming that the Iranian wants to have a deal and the Obama somehow, is not going to reach the deal. That's not true. Based on what I'm seeing, the Islamic Republic trying to just buy the time. They really don't want to reach to a new agreement for many, many different reasons. Some of them believe if the US is not reliable. You know, we signed a deal and they came. Some of them, they believe we are actually fine enough without all of the sanction, and we are managing the system, and why we have to go back and actually limit our nuclear program. Some of them wants to have a nuclear, active nuclear program. So they don't want to have to reach a new deal. They want to surround that, I tell it. And based on that, my advice to the Biden administration is to try to think long-term. If the Iranian people are the best asset you have in the very crazy world, in the very crazy region, you have to try to keep them on your side and you have to support them.
So I want to bring the conversation, depending on one's point of view, back to 35,000 feet or 10,000 feet, depending on how you interpret this. And I want to do it through a question that's come in through the chat, which I think personifies some of this discord that we've been discussing, and also gets to the heart of the matter. And the question is, and I do think, Negar, this was directed to you, but you're both welcome to answer this and encouraged to. People in Iran are dying on the streets fighting the Islamic Republic. Their demands are clear. They want the entire regime gone, not just the morality police. You are here to carry the voices of those in peril per the description of this event. So what is your position toward the Islamic Republic regime? Do you want them gone?
Well, Jennifer, as you know, I'm trying to do journalism, professional, bring nuance and analysis. I don't do advocacy, even though I like to. Let me just explain. My personal situation is that I've lived under pressure from that regime for 13 years in exile, my family, many pressures. So when I talk to some of my friends who can still freely travel, come back and forth, paid no price, no pressure from the government, obviously my position would be clear that I'm personally affected and under pressure from that regime. But as far as what the people on the ground want, we can say what the protesters want. We're hearing very radical slogans from the protesters. Yes, the core of it, one of the main slogans, woman, life, freedom, Jen, Jian, Azadi, or Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, which goes back to that core of this feminist revolution, the women's uprising. But we're also hearing death to the dictator, death to the Islamic Republic, to the entirety of the system, loud and clear from these protesters. And we've heard them gradually in past protests, even as far back as 2009. I remember hearing that slogan, but much less loud than we're hearing it today, and less widespread. So definitely there's a big portion of these protesters and also of the population who want an end or a systemic change, because they don't see any avenue for reform, for change within the system, for any form of political, essentially, avenue besides this very radical pursuing on the street. But is that something that diminishes, for example, the demand of abolishing the morality police? So what if this regime isn't gone in a month or in 2 months? What if this very radical slogan is not addressed in short or long term? I don't want to talk about long term, but in short term. We also hearing smaller concrete demands, for example, for the abolishing of the morality police. That's still an encompassing demand within this bigger picture. They don't necessarily contradict each other, but I think it's in the bigger picture when you want to essentially break it down into what is it about this regime that you don't want, or what is it that is bothering you so much that you want this radical change. So I've been speaking about this online campaign, for example, by hijabi women, and I think it's significant that we're also hearing from religious Iranians an opposition to some of these laws. There was a campaign by hijabi women essentially saying that I am hijabi, but I oppose the morality police. There was campaigns calling for the abolishment of the morality police. This is even before the death of Mahsa Amini. Months before, there was another woman, Sepide Rashno, she gets into an argument on the bus with a woman who's trying to tell her to wear her hijab, and she gets into an argument. The woman tells her, I'm going to call the IRGC on you, and she actually does. Sepide Rashno is later identified, arrested, taken on state government TV, and she's forced into a confession against herself and I guess praising the mandatory hijab. Months before, there was a very iconic image, disturbing, of a mother who was pushing against the van of the morality police, yelling please don't take my daughter, she's sick. So the daughter was arrested inside the police van, and the van nevertheless drove, and sort of the mother was pushed away to the sidewalk. That also created a national outcry and a conversation against the morality police. So the call to abolish the morality police, I see that as, or abolish the mandatory hijab, a large political party, the largest reformist political party, put out this statement opposing the entirety of the morality police and mandatory hijab. I see that as part of this bigger call for those who want a change in the entirety of the system, and maybe those who not every single Iranian is on the street. We don't have a poll of very clear poll. It's a very securitized and limited environment. Political polls of whether you like or you don't like the regime are very limited and hard to access or conduct. So, but those protesters that were hearing the radical slogans, those who are speaking up on social media, and those who are essentially voicing their opposition in so many ways, yes, it's that very radical demand. But I think that, for example, abolishing of the morality police and the mandatory hijab is something that's in the big part of that bigger demand and picture for some who may not want that bigger change, but in the short term at least, a change in what's affecting them in their everyday life.
Professor, can you expand on that?
Absolutely. There are actually a lot to say. You know, there is an Italian philosopher who said impartiality is a dream, but honesty is a duty. Without any doubt, we are not impartial. You know, we are human beings and we are affected by one way or another way. So, you know, I believe, you know, again, we don't have a poll. You're right, completely. We cannot say how many percent of the people are, you know, voting for this or voting for that. But we know that, you know, in the political science, dictatorship has a very small social base. The definition of authoritarianism is they are relying more on the security and repression that, you know, the legitimacy or people consents. There are some authoritarian regime like China, for example, much more, you know, legitimate in terms of how they are delivering the good, and, you know, they are bringing 5 million people, for example, from the poor to the middle class. But in the case of the Islamic Republic, that is, you know, the mismanagement, this corruption is huge. We don't have a meritocracy. We don't have this strong social support. We have active opposition, and the most people who are, you know, maybe they don't go to the street. But it's this is a mistake of Ayatollah Khamenei, who believed that only the people who are opposing him are the people who are at the street and chanting a slogan. There are a lot of people. We are talking about one of the most brutal, ruthless authoritarian regime in 2019. Only in 2 days, the Islamic Republic killed between 300 to 1,500. 300 is the Ministry of Interior information, the data statistic, and 1,500 for the Reuters. The reformist websites call it about 690 deaths. So we are talking about this situation. I call it that this Islamic Republic as is becoming a police state, mostly is relying on the repression. The last thing, Islamic Republic is based on 3 principles. The hijab, morality police, anti-Semitism, and anti-Americanism. Islamic Republic is not going to lose any of these pillars. You know, just to give you a feedback, 1 month, 4 weeks after these massive protests, the Iranian chief of the police went to the seminary school in Qom and promised to the clergy that from the next month we are going back to impose the morality police on the street. Most of this clergy, every day they are talking that we are not going to lose the hijab. Hijab is actually our identity, you know, the divide between us and other people. Ayatollah Khamenei, if you study Ayatollah Khamenei personalities, you will realize he never ever go back 1 step. He believed that 1 step backward, the opposition, the protester will come 2 steps forward. So even if you want to have the morality police go, even if you want to have the freedom in choosing your clothes, you cannot have it under the Islamic Republic. You know, fortunately or unfortunately, based on your political opinion.
So I infer from the way you frame that you don't believe that the Islamic Republic of Iran is capable of ever normalizing relations, or I should say, changing its rejection of the existence of Israel.
Yes, absolutely. You know, the Israel is the most, bold red line that you can imagine for the Islamic Republic is the identity issue. You know, we are making a lot of mistakes, especially in even among of my colleagues, that they usually use the Western concept like a nation state and try to enforce it in other countries and other, other societies. We thinking about Iran as a nation state, and that's a wrong idea. If you study the core ideology of the Islamic Republic, you will realize they believe that, yes, we are some nation, but we are under one umbrella called the Ummah. And Ayatollah Khamenei is the leader of this Ummah. For these ideologies, a Shia Lebanese is much more closer than me and Negar for the Ayatollah Khamenei. You know, any Shia that believes the interpretation of Ayatollah Khamenei, the political Islam, is much closer that not only the Iranian Sunni, the Shia Iranian, the Persian Shia Iranian, who don't believe to this idea. So if we stop using the Western concept, these Western theories that we are teaching it in academia, and try to understand what they really are talking about, we have a better understanding. To give the last statement, if you remember, a few days before Russia, Putin invade Ukraine, most of the Western journalists, academics, even the big name, believe that the Putin is not going to invade Ukraine, based on all of this theory and all of this idea. And we saw that the Putin did that. So we have to understand them. And if we want to understand them, we have to take their word seriously. They are not only for domestic use. They are actually talking about their idea, their ideology. We usually don't want to listen to them.
So, okay, in sort of coming off of that thread and in closing, in Negar, I'd love you to pick up, here's your 60-second round here. Where do you think we're going to be, without the benefit of a crystal ball, in Iran in 6 months?
I don't know. It's very difficult to say. Where a lot of the protesters and many of the Iranians I speak to want to be, the radical slogans we're hearing against the entirety of the regime is just, I don't know. It's also I want to point out to another question that people ask, many inside Iran especially, talk to me, what's after? What's next? We're seeing a very grassroots, leaderless, essentially organic movement on the ground, but also a lot of divisions and rifts within the Iranian society, many ethnic groups, many different areas and provinces. And so where would, even if a regime change does happen or a toppling of the entire system, the government, what's next? Who's going to come after? And this is by a generation who's seen the impacts of the 1979, a revolution, a sort of a destruction, chaotic moment after that, and what came after that revolution, what was thought by many revolutionaries, including many women, and what came after the revolution as far as what was promised and what was actually materialized. So this is another worry. And then they also look to their some of their neighbors. They look to Libya, they look to Syria, they look to Iraq, they look to Afghanistan, and that worries especially the middle class, urban middle class Iranians who want a better life, but they still don't want to sort of give their life or essentially lose it for that better future. So it's difficult to say. It really depends on how these different intersectional communities continue and sustain their protests. The oil workers, that's something very important to watch, but how long is that going to sustain? Would that be a serious blow to the economy, to the state? It's still unclear. University students are going strong, high schoolers. It's just very incredible and very unique, but we're also seeing a lot of violence and just presence. I've talked to sources in different cities, including Tehran, a lot of security presence, police forces, various different forces on the street. And what seems hasn't happened yet is the kind of crackdown we saw in 2019, an immediate iron fist, a deployment of all kinds of different forces. It actually hasn't happened to that extent yet this time around. So it could get worse. It could get bloodier with the fire at Evin prison and all of that. It's just a messy situation. I'm watching and
hard to confirm a lot of
in short, yes,
the violence. We don't have necessarily all of that verified as much as we want to know. It could be even much worse than we know. Professor?
Oh, to say that, absolutely right that we cannot predict what will happen in the future. But don't forget, many of the problems that we see in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, is actually made by the Islamic Republic and IRGC support force. Who made Syria Syria? We started in 2012, as early 2012, and brutally helped the Syrian regime to kill all of these people. So if the problem, the root of the problem is gone, most of this legitimate fear will gone with that. And don't forget, we cannot compare the Iranian society with the Libyan society. Libyan under the Muammar Gaddafi was not a country, was a tribe, by one ruler. We are talking about a very active society from 1905 constitutional revolution to now. This society is always trying to push toward the democracy and the human rights. We are talking about a very tech-savvy 4 million students at the university, 11 million higher education graduate in Iran. Very different situation. And I'm unlike Negar, I'm very optimistic about the future.
Well, on that note, thank you very much for your time, both to Professor and Negar. I know how busy you both are, and we really appreciate it. Thanks to my colleagues at the Institute of Politics, and especially the University of Chicago, for supporting and putting on this event, even in the face of some pretty enormous pressures and actual threats. So thank you to all of you, and all of you watching again on YouTube, and we'll see you in our next discussion. Bye.
Thanks for
Thanks
having
for having us.
Thank you.